My name is Laura, and I live in Illinois. What happened to me could have been the end of my story. Even today, 5 years later, I relive every detail with a clarity that haunts me. Sometimes it feels like my entire body is still trapped in that moment, unable to move forward. No matter what I do to try to bury those memories, they return, relentless, as if they were tattoos on my mind. I worked for 5 years at the same investment consulting firm. It was a competitive, intense environment, and like any place like that, full of fake smiles and rivalries disguised as camaraderie. Even so, I liked what I did. I built my career through hard work, facing each challenge as a battle. Luca was part of that scene. He was one of those ever-present faces, someone who shared the routine without ever standing out too much. Luca seemed friendly. He was polite, helpful when needed, but kept a certain distance, as if there was an invisible barrier he never allowed anyone to cross. He wasn't my close friend, but he was never hostile either. He was the kind of person you just assumed was there, someone you felt comfortable working with, even if you didn't really know him. When I got promoted, it was a milestone in my life. That position was highly sought after. I knew my effort had brought me there, but I also noticed the sideways glances in the office. Envy is a subtle presence, almost imperceptible, but real. I could feel it, like a weight in the air, but I never imagined it would come from him. That damn smile of his gives me chills and disgust. The news was announced at a weekly meeting. Most of my colleagues smiled, clapped, made positive comments. Luca did too, and he was the first. He stood up from his chair and came to me with a smile that seemed sincere, though his eyes carried something else, something I couldn't decipher at the time. He congratulated me warmly, said I deserved it, and even joked that I would finally have someone to challenge the bosses. At first, it seemed like just another typical office joke. In the days that followed, he showed no signs of anything unusual. If he was angry or frustrated, he hid it well. Luca continued with his impeccably normal behavior, too normal, in fact. But who would suspect a friendly smile, a casual greeting in the hallway, from someone who had always been so predictable? And that's what scares me the most when I look back. He wasn't the type of person who would raise suspicions. He didn't have temper tantrums, didn't make malicious comments, didn't show any sign of envy. He was like any other colleague. But in that smile he gave me when congratulating me, there was something hidden, an almost imperceptible discomfort, a spark of something darker. The promotion, for me, was a reason to celebrate. For him, it was the last straw. I didn't know, but by that moment, he had already decided that I didn't deserve it. That my life, my victory, needed to be ruined. 2 days after the promotion, Luca asked me to go out. He came to my desk with his usual casual manner, saying he wanted to celebrate my achievement. No hidden intentions, he stressed, almost as if trying to preempt any suspicion. He explained that it wouldn't be a private dinner, but a celebration among colleagues. I thought it was odd at the time, we hadn't been that close outside of work. I refused at first, making up some excuse. But he insisted. It'll be good for you. A time to unwind, away from the pressure of the office. I hesitated, but after so many years working together, what could go wrong? He wasn't my friend, but he'd never given me a reason to distrust him. After all, 5 years of sharing the same space created an automatic kind of trust. The place he chose was strange. A discreet bar, outside of downtown Aurora, hidden on a quiet street. It wasn't exactly what I expected for a celebration, but I decided not to question it. Maybe he preferred calmer places. We arrived early, and the bar was almost empty. The atmosphere was dim, with a low light that seemed more suited to secret meetings than celebrations. Luca seemed calm, maybe even overly friendly. I ordered a glass of white wine, while he chose something stronger. We started talking. He asked questions about the promotion, about my plans for the new position. I answered, not realizing the conversation was becoming more and more focused on me, as if he were studying every word. While he spoke, something bothered me. He was smiling too much, more than usual. It wasn't that natural smile, but something forced, almost rehearsed. But I chalked it up to the celebratory mood, or maybe some nervousness. After all, we had never gone out together outside of work. After a while, I needed to go to the bathroom. When I returned, Luca was sitting exactly as before, hands clasped on the table, eyes fixed on me, as if he hadn't moved. I found it odd, but didn't think much of it. I grabbed my glass and, without thinking, brought it to my lips. That's when everything changed. Before I could taste the first small sip, I felt a sudden movement beside me. A man, sitting at the next table, stood up so quickly that he knocked over his chair. He crossed the small distance between us and snatched the glass from my hand with such force that it almost made me fall backward. "Don't drink that," he said, breathless, his voice filled with urgency and fear. The whole bar, or what few customers were there, turned to look. I stood frozen, not understanding anything. When I regained my senses, I looked at Luca. He was pale, his eyes wide, as if he'd been caught red-handed. In seconds, he stood up, shoved his chair back, and ran toward the exit without looking back. The sound of his hurried steps echoed on the wooden floor as he disappeared into the darkness. I stood there, stunned, as my throat began to burn. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. I was stunned, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to understand what was happening. The man, his eyes fixed on mine, seemed more scared than I was. "Don't drink that," he repeated, now almost shouting. His voice echoed through the empty bar, filled with something that seemed more than urgency. It was absolute terror. It was as if time had frozen for a moment, and then everything happened too quickly. I turned to Luca, seeking an explanation, but he was already standing. His eyes were wide, like an animal cornered. He didn't say a word. He just took 2 steps back, turned and bolted for the exit, knocking over the chair in the process. The sound of his footsteps echoed in my head as he disappeared into the night. It was then that I realized. My throat started to burn slightly, as if something corrosive was settling in. A second later, an overwhelming nausea took over me. My stomach twisted as if it wanted to expel something that shouldn't be there. My vision blurred, and the lights in the bar began to dance in confusing patterns. "Are you okay?" the man beside me asked, grabbing my arm to keep me upright. But I couldn't answer. My words were stuck, my mouth dry, my body growing weaker by the second. I felt my legs give out, and he caught me before I collapsed onto the floor. "Call an ambulance," he yelled at the bartender, who seemed frozen by the surreal scene. His voice sounded distant, like I was hearing it from underwater. Every second felt like an eternity as my body fought against something I couldn't see. At the hospital, reality hit me like a blow. The doctors were quick to act, administering medication and performing gastric lavage. Later, one of them explained, in a tone of seriousness that froze me to the bone, that the drink had been contaminated with a toxic substance, something deliberately placed there. "You were lucky you ingested such a small amount," he said, with a grave expression. "One more sip, and we wouldn't be having this conversation." I spent days in the hospital, the excruciating weakness overtaking my body. Every movement felt like an effort of Herculean proportions, and my mind couldn't stop asking the same question. How could someone I had known for years do something like this? How did I miss the signs? Even when I began to physically recover, my mind remained trapped in that moment. The feeling of powerlessness, of being at the mercy of something invisible, wouldn't leave me. I couldn't erase the image of Luca fleeing, the sound of his footsteps echoing in my head like an endless trail. Luca was arrested in Aurora a few weeks later. The police found the traces he had left behind, the poison purchased online, the messages where he expressed his envy and frustration over my promotion. He didn't bother hiding his feelings, thinking that perhaps no one would connect the dots, but they did. The revelation was like a knife slowly entering my skin. During the 5 years we worked together, Luca hid his true face, making me believe he was just another coworker. He knew how to play the game, how to behave appropriately, how to be everyone's friend, while in reality, he was planning something much darker. I saw him every day, talked to him as if he were trustworthy, but he had always been a monster disguised as a human. Today, I'm alive, but I'm not the same. That night left deep marks, invisible scars that no one can see, but that I feel every moment of my life. And every time I hear someone mention Luca's name, it brings that same burning sensation in my throat. I will never forget what happened. I won't forgive it. My name is Joe. I'm 33 years old, and my life has never been anything extraordinary. Working as a parking lot attendant downtown was monotonous, but it paid the bills. My shift started at 6 p.m. and ended at 2 a.m., a time most people avoid, but I'd learned to deal with it. The nights were quiet, so quiet that any unusual sound felt like a scream in my ears. The parking lot was underground, with 5 levels that were almost empty after 8 p.m. I'd make rounds, fill out reports, and occasionally help a confused driver. But lately, something had been bothering me. Cars were disappearing. Not many, and not all at once. An SUV here, a sedan there, small enough to go unnoticed unless you were paying attention. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was boredom, or maybe curiosity, but I started keeping track of the missing vehicles. I wrote down the times, models, and dates. At first, it was just to pass the time, but in hindsight, I was digging my own grave. My manager, Carlos, was a man of few words. He'd come in, do the bare minimum, and leave before midnight. Lately, though, he seemed tense. The kind of tension that makes a person jump at a simple good evening. I should have ignored it, but something in my gut told me he knew more than he let on. On a Tuesday night, I finally decided to confront him. "Carlos, can I show you something?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He nodded without looking up from his phone. I showed him my notes, pointing out the patterns I'd noticed: times, car types, days of the week. He stared at the papers and then at me. Something shifted in his expression. It wasn't anger, but a cold, calculated look, like he was deciding what to do with me. "Joe, you're new here. You don't know how things work." His voice was calm, almost friendly. "Just drop it, okay? It's not your problem." I should have stopped there, but his words felt more like a threat than advice. That night, I went home with a heavy feeling in my chest. Something was very wrong. By Thursday, I had my answer. It was almost midnight. The parking lot was empty except for a few scattered cars on the lower levels. I was finishing my round on the 3rd floor when I heard footsteps echoing in the silence. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. It wasn't normal to see anyone there at that hour, so I stayed on alert. "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice echoed back at me. Nothing. I kept walking, trying to ignore the chill running down my spine. Then I felt someone behind me. Before I could turn around, strong arms grabbed me by the neck and threw me to the ground. I struggled, but they pinned me easily. Two hooded men dragged me to a secluded corner of the parking lot and tied me to a chair with duct tape. One of them spoke on the phone while I sat there, heart pounding. Minutes later, Carlos showed up. "I warned you, Joe." He was calmer than I expected, almost indifferent. "You're too stubborn for your own good." "What is this, Carlos?" My voice shook. "I was just trying to figure out what's going on." He sighed like my ignorance annoyed him. "It's simple. You saw too much. Now I have no choice." One of the men punched me in the face so hard I saw white. When I came to, Carlos was standing in front of me, holding a knife. "You should have minded your own business, kid." I knew this was the end. I closed my eyes, bracing for the blade, but a distant sound saved me. A car alarm went off. Carlos hesitated. His men went to check out the noise. In that moment, something in me snapped. I used every ounce of strength I had to free my hands. As soon as I was loose, I grabbed the chair and threw it at Carlos, knocking him off balance. Then I ran without looking back. The parking lot felt like a maze. Every shadow looked like an enemy. I could hear their footsteps closing in as blood dripped from the gash on my arm. Finally, I found an emergency stairwell and bolted up to the street. When I reached the surface, I stumbled and fell but kept running. I didn't stop until I found a police car. I told them everything, every detail. They arrested Carlos and his men that same night. I survived, but not without scars. Now paranoia is my constant companion. Every sudden sound makes me jump. Every shadow feels like a threat. Nights are the worst when I close my eyes. I see Carlos's knife glinting in the dim light and hear his cold, emotionless voice. I made it out alive, but a part of me never left that parking lot. I work in a small, unassuming store nestled inside a bustling shopping mall near my home. It's the kind of place that often gets overlooked, a cozy little shop selling accessories and the occasional pair of shoes. The setup is simple. One employee per shift, no frills, no backup. Most days, it's quiet. The noise of the mall hums outside like a distant tide, but inside the store, it's calm. Peaceful, even. That Thursday, however, was different. The mall was its usual chaotic self, people swarming like bees in a hive, rushing from one shop to another. My shift began like any other, me alone behind the counter, greeting the occasional customer with a polite smile and helping them find what they needed. It was mid-afternoon when he walked in. At first glance, there was nothing overtly alarming about him. He was short and wiry, with a mustard yellow shirt that had clearly seen better days. His black pants hung awkwardly on his frame, and his hair looked like it hadn't been acquainted with a comb in weeks. But as he approached, a wave of stale cigarette smoke hit me, making me instinctively recoil. His teeth, stained an unnatural yellow, flashed as he smiled a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He came straight to the counter, his gaze fixed on me in a way that immediately set off alarms in my head. "Hi," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "I've been watching you." The words sent a chill down my spine. I tried to stay professional, though my instincts screamed at me to back away. "Can I help you with something?" I asked, forcing a polite smile. He didn't answer my question. Instead, he leaned closer, resting his elbows on the counter. "You're beautiful," he said, his eyes scanning me in a way that made my skin crawl. "I've been watching you for a while now." The way he said it was far from complimentary, it was predatory. The kind of tone that made it clear he wasn't admiring me. He was fixated on me. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady despite the unease curling in my stomach. I moved subtly, putting more distance between us. He kept talking, his words becoming more personal, more invasive. I can't remember everything he said, most of it is a blur now, but I'll never forget the way he stared, like I was prey. Then, he said something that turned my unease into outright fear. "We should go somewhere. Just you and me." I shook my head, keeping my tone polite but firm. "I don't think so." "When's your shift over?" he pressed, his smile widening. "I don't share my schedule with strangers," I said, keeping my voice as even as possible. His expression darkened briefly before he forced the smile back onto his face. "All right," he said finally, "I'll see you around." With that, he left. The moment he was out of sight, I exhaled a shaky breath. My hands trembled as I tried to refocus on my work, convincing myself that it was over, but it wasn't. About 25 minutes later, I saw him again. He wasn't inside the store this time, he was outside, pacing slowly in front of the window. His eyes never left me. I ignored him, pretending to be busy with something behind the counter. Eventually, he walked away. Less than an hour after that, he returned. This time, he kept his distance, lingering further down the hallway, but his gaze was unmistakable. He was watching me. By the end of my shift, my nerves were frayed. I grabbed my things and headed toward the parking lot, weaving through the crowded mall in the hopes of losing him if he was still around. I glanced back a few times, but I didn't see him. For a brief moment, I let myself relax. But then, as I neared the exit, I caught sight of him again. He was there, standing just a few feet behind me, his eyes locked onto me like a predator tracking its prey. My heart pounded as I quickened my pace, hoping to lose him in the crowd. Each time I glanced back, he was closer. There were people everywhere, but none of them seemed to notice the silent chase unfolding. I made a sharp turn into an unfamiliar corridor, hoping to shake him. The thought of finding a security guard crossed my mind, but the mall was so large and chaotic that there was no guarantee I'd run into one. I ducked into a large department store, weaving through the aisles in an erratic pattern. For a moment, I thought I'd lost him. I lingered near the back of the store, pretending to browse, my heart racing. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him enter. He was relentless. I darted out of the store and into the main mall, my mind racing with panic. The crowd felt like a double-edged sword. In one hand, it provided cover. On the other, it made it harder to spot help. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I glanced back and didn't see him. Relief washed over me as I hurried toward the parking lot, desperate to get to my car and leave this nightmare behind. The parking lot was quieter than I expected, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the rows of cars. I reached into my purse, fumbling for my keys as I approached my car. And then I saw him. He was leaning against my driver's side door, arms crossed, a twisted smile on his face. Time seemed to freeze. My breath caught in my throat as his eyes met mine, filled with something dark and malicious. "Hello again," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "What do you want?" I managed to ask, my voice shaking. His smile widened. "You." That one word sent a surge of adrenaline through me. I turned to run back toward the mall, but he was faster. He lunged, grabbing me from behind and clamping a hand over my mouth. I struggled, trying to scream, but his grip was like iron. He dragged me toward a secluded area of the parking lot, where a maintenance door loomed in the shadows. My mind raced as I fought against him, my keys still clutched in my hand. Just as we reached the door, a deep voice shouted, "Hey, let her go!" Heavy footsteps thundered toward us. The man released me instantly, shoving me aside as he bolted across the parking lot. The security guard reached me moments later, his face lined with concern. "Are you okay? Did he hurt you?" I shook my head, my body trembling too much to speak. The guard stayed with me until the police arrived. They reviewed the security footage and identified the man, arresting him the next day. It turned out he had a history of harassment, including a restraining order filed by his ex-partner. I never saw him again, but the experience left a permanent mark on me. I still work at the same store, but I'm no longer the same person. Every time I leave the mall, I'm hyper-aware of my surroundings, pepper spray clutched tightly in my hand. Because once you've been hunted, you never forget the feeling of being prey. I've never been the kind of person to believe in the supernatural. Maybe it's because I'm a nurse, and I spend more time trying to keep people alive than thinking about things I can't explain. But that night, something happened. Something that changed everything. It was a slow night at the small hospital where I work. Quiet, isolated, just 2 floors, and a skeleton crew. When you work in a place like that, anything out of the ordinary stands out. I was in the ward organizing charts when I noticed the blood stain. It was small, just a few drops on the main corridor floor, but it was out of place. We hadn't had any emergencies that night, and all the patients were stable. I followed the trail along the polished floor until it stopped in front of the supply closet at the end of the corridor. The door was locked. I grabbed my flashlight and examined the handle. There was no sign of forced entry, but when I shone the light on the knob, I noticed blood smeared on it. "Damn it," I muttered under my breath, my heart starting to race. I knew no one else should have access to the closet besides us, the night nurses. I pulled out the key and unlocked the door. The smell hit me immediately. Metallic, sharp, nauseating. My fingers trembled as I flicked on the small light inside. And there, sitting on a shelf among the gauze and syringes, was a mask. It was grotesque, made of thick leather, with dried blood staining the surface and jagged cuts forming a twisted smile. I picked it up hesitantly, trying to understand how it had ended up there. It wasn't something that belonged in a hospital. Immediately, I looked around, straining to hear footsteps or any sound that might indicate I wasn't alone. But there was nothing, only the oppressive silence of the corridor. I locked the closet in a hurry and went to the security room. I asked Lucio, the night guard, to review the cameras. He sighed, probably thinking I was being paranoid, but he agreed. "That's odd," he said after a few minutes. His brow furrowed as we stared at the grainy footage on the monitors. "Look at this." On the recording, you could see the supply closet. At 2:37 a.m., something moved in the shadows. A tall figure wearing what looked like a heavy coat stepped into the corridor and stood in front of the closet. The face was obscured, the camera couldn't capture any details. They stood there for several seconds before disappearing out of view. "Did anyone leave or enter after that?" I asked. Lucio shook his head, his frown deepening. "Not a soul." I went back to the corridor, my nerves on edge. Every sound, every creak felt magnified, as if the hospital itself was testing me. I forced myself to finish my shift, convincing myself it was all just a misunderstanding or maybe some sick prank. Then came the second night. I had just finished checking on the patients when I heard it, a low, continuous sound, like a faint whistle. It seemed to come from the end of the corridor, near the supply closet. This time, I was ready. I grabbed a scalpel from my pocket and followed the sound, my shoes squeaking against the polished floor. When I rounded the corner, the corridor was empty. Or so I thought. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move quickly, almost too fast to catch. My heart pounded as I ran back to the security room. Lucio was staring at the monitors, his face pale with an expression I'd never seen on him before, pure terror. "He's here," he whispered. On the screen, the masked figure was standing in the middle of the corridor, staring directly at the camera. Lucio's breathing grew heavy as he grabbed the radio to call for backup. Before he could finish, the lights flickered and the feed cut out. Everything happened too fast after that. When the power returned, Lucio was unconscious on the floor, and I was alone. I should have left. I should have called the police. But something kept me in the hospital. Maybe it was the feeling that if I left, he'd follow me. By the third night, I began to feel his presence even when I couldn't see him. It was as if he was everywhere, watching me, a shadow in the glass, a reflection in the surgical instruments. And then I saw him. He was standing in the doorway of the ward, wearing the leather mask. It looked dirtier now, with fresh streaks of blood dripping from it. I don't know what gave me the courage, but I yelled, "Who are you? What do you want?" He didn't answer. He just stood there, unmoving, before disappearing the moment I blinked. After that night, things got worse. My colleagues started noticing strange things too. Surgical gloves went missing. Syringes were found out of place, and everyone had the feeling we were being watched. I decided to quit my job after I saw my reflection in the bathroom mirror. For a moment, it wasn't me looking back. It was him, the mask, the smile. Now I'm at home. I avoid mirrors, windows, and anything that might reflect my face. But he's still with me. I see him when I turn off the lights, smell the leather when I try to sleep. Maybe he was never real. Maybe I'm losing my mind. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it, that faint, low whistle, and I know he's here, waiting. The muffled sound of the door chime mixed with the hum of the flickering fluorescent lights overhead. It was the third time that night the power had momentarily faltered, plunging the gas station into a disturbing darkness before the harsh light returned. I worked the night shift at a gas station on a nearly deserted stretch of highway in rural Wisconsin. My name is Laura, and for almost 4 years, this lonely routine has been my life. That night started like any other. A few truck drivers came through, exchanging quick conversations while paying for diesel, followed by the deafening silence of the hours between 3 and 4 a.m., when the world seems frozen. I was behind the counter, idly playing solitaire on the computer, when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A trail of blood. At first, I thought it was a trick of my exhausted mind. I stepped closer to the glass door and peered outside. There it was, a line of dark droplets beginning near one of the pumps and leading around the side of the building toward the storage shed. A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe an injured animal had passed through, or maybe one of the truckers had gotten hurt. I grabbed a flashlight from under the counter and stepped outside to check. The air was freezing, and the silence of the night felt heavier out there. The trail was uneven but unmistakably fresh. The droplets still glistened under the flashlight beam. "If this is some drunk idiot pulling a prank," I muttered to myself, trying to mask the growing knot of fear in my chest. I followed the trail, which led me to the door of the storage shed, a rusted, weathered structure where we kept tools and empty boxes. The door was slightly ajar, swaying gently in the wind. Something felt wrong. My fingers were cold and trembling as I pushed the door open. The sharp smell of rust, oil, and something metallic and nauseating hit me like a wave. In the corner, near a stack of boxes, was a large knife. Not a regular knife. It was big, heavy, and stained with something I didn't need to examine to know was blood. Then I heard it. A sound. A single heavy step on the floor behind me. My body froze. The sound wasn't coming from the door but from inside the shed. Slowly and silently, I swung the flashlight toward the noise. The unsteady beam illuminated a silhouette in the far corner, barely distinguishable from the shadows. A tall figure, broad-shouldered, stood motionless like a statue. "Who's there?" My voice barely rose above a whisper. No response. And then, it moved. Not fast, but enough to make me drop the flashlight in sheer panic. The clatter echoed in the cramped space, and within seconds, I was sprinting out of the shed, my breath slicing through the icy air. I locked the store's door the moment I was inside and dashed for the phone behind the counter. My hands shook so badly, it took me 3 attempts to dial the police. When I finally got through, I explained what I had seen. They said they'd send someone, but it might take time because of the distance to the nearest station. 30 minutes. I tried to convince myself the man wouldn't follow me into the store, but then I saw something that nearly stopped my heart. On the sidewalk outside, a shadow. He was standing there, staring directly at me through the glass door. The phone was still in my hand. "He's here," I whispered to the dispatcher. "Stay where you are. Don't confront the suspect," she said, her voice professional but tense. I couldn't take my eyes off him. The dim station lights partially illuminated his face. He had a small, distorted smile and was holding something in his hand. I didn't need a second look to know what it was, the knife from the shed. Suddenly, he took a step forward and pushed on the door. I knew it was locked, but the sound of pressure on the handle was enough to send my heart racing. He wasn't trying to break in, at least not yet. It was as if he was toying with me, savoring my reaction. "Go away," I yelled, my voice louder than I intended. He didn't answer, just tilted his head slightly as if considering my words. Then, he began tapping the door with the knife rhythmically, each tap echoing like a drumbeat. Tap, tap, tap. The dispatcher was still on the line, asking me to describe what was happening, but I could barely hear her. My focus was entirely on him. After a few moments, he stopped. For a second, I thought he'd given up, but then he raised the knife and pointed to the side of the store, where one of the windows was. My heart leaped into my throat. I ran to the window, but it was too late. He was already outside, tapping on it with the same insistent rhythm. This time, the glass began to crack. Without thinking, I grabbed the baseball bat we kept under the counter for emergencies and braced myself for the worst. The window finally shattered, shards of glass falling like rain, and he climbed inside. The sight of him inside the store was like a nightmare brought to life. He was tall, dressed in a stained jumpsuit, and that knife gleamed under the harsh station lights. He moved slowly, each step echoing on the tile floor. "Please, don't do this," I pleaded, my voice breaking. He didn't respond, but his smile grew even more twisted. I raised the bat with all the strength I could muster and swung when he got close enough. I hit his arm, the sound of something breaking reverberating through the air. He grunted but didn't stop. I swung again, this time hitting his face. He stumbled back, but not before the knife grazed my arm, leaving a thin, searing line of pain. I ran to the opposite end of the store, my arm burning and my vision blurring from tears. He slowly got up, clutching his face, blood dripping between his fingers. Then, the parking lot lights flooded the area. Sirens. He looked at me one last time, as if memorizing my face, before turning and fleeing through the broken window. The police arrived seconds later. I collapsed, the bat still in my bloodied hand, as the officers searched the area. They never found him. A few days later, I learned that a butcher from a nearby restaurant had been missing for weeks. The knife he used daily matched the one I found in the shed. Now, every time I hear heavy footsteps or the sound of tapping, my heart races. Even at home, with the doors locked and the lights on, I can't shake the feeling he's still out there, waiting. Because he knew where to find me, and something in his eyes told me this wasn't over. If this story sent chills down your spine, don't forget to hit the like button. It helps us bring you more of the most terrifying tales. And if you're not yet subscribed to American Terrifying Tales, make sure to do it now and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next chilling story. We'd love to know, which story scared you the most so far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Your feedback means everything to us. And don't stop here. Check out the other videos on the channel and dive even deeper into this dark, eerie world. See you in the next story, if you dare.